Imagine the endless steppes, where the wind kicks up dust and the night sky is strewn with millions of stars. Here, in the very heart of Central Asia, amidst harsh nature and nomadic tribes, arose one of the most remarkable civilizations, the Turks. Their homes were yurts, their roads the vast steppe, their law the word of the chieftain, and their wealth horses and weapons. The Turks were always nomads, their lives inextricably linked to horses, livestock, and the ability to move quickly. They had no stone cities, nor did they need them, for their defense lay in speed, martial skill, and the art of survival in extreme conditions. They herded sheep, hunted, and knew how to adapt to cold winters and scorching deserts. Their children learned to shoot bows and ride from a young age, while the men could cover hundreds of kilometers. But why did they leave Central Asia, their native steppe? There were several reasons. Firstly, nature wasn't always kind to them. Droughts, harsh winters, and shrinking pastures forced the nomads to seek new lands. Secondly, power struggles among the Turkic tribes often led to wars, and the vanquished were either destroyed or forced to seek refuge elsewhere. And thirdly, one cannot forget their powerful neighbors. To the east, the Chinese dominated, initially seeking alliances but later pressuring the nomads with military force. The Great Wall of China was built precisely against peoples like the Turks. To the south, the Persians, who considered them savages and barbarians, and to the west, vast unexplored lands where those unwilling to submit could go. But fear and necessity were not the only drivers for the Turks. A dream of a great future always lived within them. They weren't just fleeing, they were seeking a new place where they could grow stronger. They believed that Tengri, the sky god, would show them the way. And one day, this path led some of the Turks westward to where, centuries later, one of the world's most powerful empires would arise, the Ottoman Empire. But for now, they were merely small tribes crossing Asia Minor, seeking a place to settle. The people were weary from the long migrations, but leading them was Ertuğrul, a chieftain who believed in his people's future. His Kaya tribe, like many others, had left Central Asia. The steppes had become crowded. Wars followed one after another, and powerful neighbors pushed the nomads westward. They passed through the lands of other Turkic peoples, crossed the Caucasus, and found themselves in Anatolia, a region where the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum was weakening. This was in the first half of the 13th century, when the Ottoman Empire did not yet exist, and Anatolia was fragmented among Seljuk emirates, Byzantine remnants, and the looming Mongol threat from the east. Continuous conflict reigned in these lands, and Ertuğrul quickly realized that to establish themselves here, he needed to choose allies. According to legend, one day he and his warriors stumbled upon a battle in which one side was clearly outnumbered. Without hesitation, he decided to intervene and support the weaker side. It was a risky move, as he didn't know who was fighting, but fortune favored him. Those he aided were warriors of the Seljuk Sultan Kaikubad I. According to various accounts, after the victory, the Sultan rewarded Ertuğrul and, as a sign of gratitude, granted him lands near Söğüt. This became a turning point. Having received his own territory, albeit small, Ertuğrul began to fortify the settlement, establish relations with the Seljuks, and fight the Byzantines, gradually expanding his borders. Today, Söğüt is a small town in Turkey, located in the Bilecik province. It was there that the roots of the future Ottoman Empire were planted. Symbolically, Ertuğrul is buried here, and his tomb remains a place of pilgrimage to this day. Ertuğrul couldn't afford open battles against large armies, so he utilized the maneuverability of his cavalry, surprise attacks, and ambushes. Thanks to these tactics, his people began to conquer more and more land. During his years of rule, he transformed the Kaya tribe from a band of nomads into a formidable force that no longer just survived, but dictated terms to its neighbors. Ertuğrul did not live to see his descendants create the Ottoman Empire, but it was he who laid the foundation. His son, Osman, continued his work and built the state that would become one of history's most powerful empires. Osman inherited the small lands around Söğüt. At this time, the Seljuk Sultanate, to which the Turkic tribes formerly owed allegiance, was losing influence under Mongol pressure, while Byzantium struggled to hold on to its fortresses in Anatolia. Osman realized that dependence on weak rulers offered his people no future. Around 1299, he declared the independence of his Beylik principality, which would eventually grow into a vast empire. To consolidate his power, Osman began warring against Byzantium. His primary targets were small but strategically important fortresses that controlled trade routes. He employed tactics of lightning-fast raids, capturing towns and cutting off supplies. The Byzantines were slow-moving and reliant on fortifications, while the Turkish cavalry could strike and quickly withdraw. The first major clash occurred near the city of Nicaea, when the Byzantines sent an army to halt Osman's advance. Osman and his warriors set an ambush and defeated the enemy. After this, his authority grew, and new tribes began to flock to him, eager to fight under his banner. Having established a foothold in the region, Osman continued his conquests. He captured the fortresses of Karakahisar, Bilecik, and İnegöl, and then began the siege of Bursa, a major Byzantine city and an important trading center. The Byzantines tried to send reinforcements, but their forces were weakened by internal conflicts and Osman's pressure. The siege dragged on, but it was during this time that Osman passed command to his son Orhan, who would later complete the city's conquest. A legend is associated with his rise. Osman often stayed with Sheikh Edebali, a renowned spiritual mentor. He respected his wisdom and also fell in love with his daughter, Malhun Hatun. However, the sheikh withheld his consent for the marriage for a long time. One night, dreaming in the sheikh's home, Osman saw a huge tree spreading its branches across the world, giving shade to nations. When he recounted this to Edebali, the sheikh prophesied that Osman would be the founder of a great state. After this, the sheikh agreed to give his daughter in marriage. Osman Gazi died around 1324 without seeing the fall of Bursa or the future of the Ottoman Empire. His name became the symbol of the new power, and his descendants transformed the small state into a vast empire that would shape the destiny of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East for centuries. After Osman Ghazi's death, his son Orhan inherited the Ottoman lands and was confronted with the task of expanding them. The Byzantines still controlled major cities in Anatolia, like Bursa and Nicaea, and retained influence, but their strength was sapped by internal conflicts. Orhan began a systematic offensive, using tactics that set the Ottomans apart from Europeans and Byzantines. Ottoman armies didn't rely on heavily armored troops and lengthy sieges. Instead, they utilized speed, maneuverability, and weakening the enemy before an attack. The Ottomans didn't storm fortresses immediately, but encircled them, cut off supply routes, and compelled the garrisons to surrender. The Byzantines, accustomed to conventional warfare, couldn't effectively counter such tactics. Orhan's main objective was the capture of Bursa. It was a large city with well-fortified walls, and a direct assault would have meant heavy losses. Instead, Orhan offered the garrison a deal: gold in exchange for a peaceful surrender. Exhausted by the long siege, the Byzantines agreed, opened the gates, and let the Ottomans in. But once inside the city, Orhan broke the agreement. The gold was never paid, and the defenders found themselves prisoners. This allowed him to take Bursa without a fight and make it the first capital of the Ottoman state. Orhan continued his advance. Soon, Nicaea, the former Byzantine capital in exile, fell, followed by Nicomedia. The borders of the Ottoman domains expanded, and the state itself ceased to be merely a Turkish principality. Orhan created the first regular army, laid the foundations for the future administrative system, and began transforming the Ottoman Beylik into a powerful state. Byzantium still held much of Anatolia, but the Ottomans drew close to the borders of Europe. After consolidating their position in Anatolia, the Ottomans began to expand beyond it. Their next target was the Balkans, a region composed of numerous principalities and kingdoms constantly warring amongst themselves. Byzantium, by then, could no longer defend its European possessions. The Bulgarian kingdoms were weakened by internal conflicts and wars with Hungary. The Ottomans seized this opportunity and began their advance into Europe. The key moment was the conquest of Gallipoli in 1354. The city sat on the shores of the Dardanelles and controlled the route from Asia Minor to Europe. Before this, the Ottomans had raided the Balkans but couldn't establish a permanent presence. An earthquake destroyed Gallipoli's walls, and Ottoman troops occupied the city without a fight. The Byzantines demanded its return, but Sultan Orhan refused. From this point on, the Ottomans had a foothold in Europe and began their advance. After Orhan's death, power passed to his son Murad I, who didn't limit himself to scattered raids, but began the systematic conquest of the Balkans. In 1362, he captured Adrianople, modern Edirne, which soon became the Ottoman capital. He then pushed further, subjugating Bulgarian and Serbian lands. In 1371, Ottoman forces met a combined army of Serbs and Bulgarians at the Maritsa River. The Christian army was larger, but the Ottomans attacked at night, catching the enemy completely by surprise. As a result of the battle, a significant part of Bulgaria fell under Ottoman rule, and the remaining principalities acknowledged vassalage. The next target was Serbia. Prince Lazar understood that if the Ottomans weren't stopped, his country would fall. In 1389, the Battle of Kosovo took place. The Ottoman army outnumbered the Serbian forces, but the Serbs knew the terrain well and were prepared. During the battle, both sides suffered heavy losses. A pivotal moment was the death of the Sultan. According to one version, the Serbian knight Miloš Obilić infiltrated Murad III's tent, posing as a prisoner or defector. Once close, he suddenly drew a dagger and fatally wounded the Sultan. His act became legendary. Despite the Sultan's death, the Ottomans achieved victory. The Serbian army was annihilated, and Prince Lazar was captured and executed. Afterward, Serbia acknowledged vassalage to the Ottoman Empire. Having conquered the Balkans, the Ottomans set their sights on Byzantium. They besieged Constantinople, but couldn't take it. The city was protected by formidable walls and received aid from Genoa and Venice. The Ottomans lacked a strong navy and heavy artillery to breach the city defenses. The siege had to be abandoned, but the Ottomans drew important conclusions. In the future, capturing Constantinople would require ships and powerful cannons. After the conquest of the Balkans, Ottoman expansion continued. Serbia and Bulgaria became vassals, and Ottoman borders neared Hungary. The Ottoman state transformed into a formidable power, capable of threatening all of Europe. After several failed attempts to capture Constantinople, the Ottomans finally got a ruler who could see the task through. Mehmed II, later nicknamed the Conqueror. He ascended the throne in 1451 at a young age, but his primary goal was the conquest of Constantinople, the city that remained the symbol of Byzantium and the Orthodox world. The Ottomans controlled nearly all of Anatolia and the Balkans, but Constantinople itself stood as an impregnable fortress, surrounded by thick walls, protected by the sea, and supported by allies from the west. Mehmed understood that the conventional sieges his predecessors had attempted would not yield results. The Byzantines had spent centuries fortifying the city to withstand any army, and an open assault would be suicidal. Therefore, Mehmed prepared meticulously. His first step was the construction of the Rumeli Hisar fortress on the European bank of the Bosphorus in 1452, a year before the siege. This fortress allowed the Ottomans to completely control the strait and blockade to Constantinople from the Black Sea. The city was trapped. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine V understood the inevitable, but lacked the forces to resist the Ottomans. He hoped for help from Catholic powers, but Europe was preoccupied with its own wars. In the spring of 1453, an Ottoman army of over 80,000 men approached the walls of Constantinople. The Byzantines, whose population had dwindled to about 50,000, could only muster around 7,000 defenders, including mercenaries from Genoa and Venice. Their last hope lay in the city walls, which had halted conquerors for centuries. However, Mehmed possessed a weapon previous sultans lacked. He enlisted the Hungarian engineer Urban, who designed giant cannons capable of shattering the strongest walls. The basilica cannon was over 8 meters long and fired cannonballs weighing around 500 kg. For the first time in history, the Theodosian walls faced such weaponry. The siege began in April. By day, Ottoman cannons systematically bombarded the walls. By night, the Byzantines frantically repaired them. However, the walls were massive, and artillery bombardment alone wasn't enough. Mehmed then resorted to cunning. He ordered part of his fleet dragged overland across the hills to bypass the defensive chain, blocking the entrance to the Golden Horn, a narrow inlet on the European side of modern Istanbul, separating the historic center from the mainland. In Byzantine times, it served as a natural harbor and a crucial defensive line. The inlet was ideal for mooring ships, but also provided protection from naval attacks. The Byzantines blocked the entrance to the Golden Horn with a massive chain stretched between the city walls and the fortress of Galata, preventing enemy fleets from breaking through and attacking Constantinople from the sea. Mehmed's maneuver took the Byzantines by surprise, forcing them to divide their already thin forces, weakening their overall defense. The Ottomans also used mining tunnels, trying to undermine the walls from below. However, the Byzantines discovered the tunnels and destroyed them, often trapping the attackers inside. Discontent began to grow in the Ottoman camp. Many of the Sultan's advisors suggested retreating, but Mehmed insisted on continuing the assault, even as the Byzantines managed to repair the breaches and morale flagged. In the early morning hours, the final assault began. First came the Azabs, light infantry serving as cannon fodder, tasked with drawing out the enemy's fire. Then came the Janissaries, elite troops who fought fearlessly. A section of the wall collapsed, and the Ottomans poured into the city. Emperor Constantine XIV, realizing the city had fallen, charged into the fray and died alongside his soldiers. The Ottomans captured Constantinople, and Mehmed personally rode into the city. The first place he went was Hagia Sophia, the principal church of Byzantium. There, he paused, gazed at the magnificent mosaics, and ordered it immediately converted into a mosque. This moment symbolized the end of Byzantium and the birth of a new great power. After the conquest, the city was renamed Istanbul and became the capital of the Ottoman Empire. Mehmed began restoring it, populating it with new inhabitants, and building mosques, markets, and palaces. Constantinople, the centuries-old capital of Byzantium, was now the heart of the Ottoman Empire. After the conquest of Constantinople and the transformation of the Ottoman Empire into a major world power, its territory continued to grow. The Ottomans consolidated their rule in Anatolia, subjugated the Balkans, and conquered significant parts of the Middle East and North Africa. But despite military successes, each new sultan had to prove his strength anew. Ottoman rulers could not afford weakness, and the struggle for the throne was brutal. Their positions depended not only on authority, but also on victories on the battlefield. It was in this atmosphere, in the early 16th century, that the future great sultan, Suleiman, was born. Suleiman was born in 1494 in Trabzon, the son of Sultan Selim I. His father was known for his ruthlessness, having eliminated his brothers and nephews to secure his power. In his youth, Suleiman received an excellent education, studying Islamic law, military science, literature, and philosophy. Unlike many Ottoman rulers, he loved books and patronized learning. However, in the Ottoman Empire, knowledge alone was not enough. he had to be a warrior. In 1511, Suleiman was appointed governor of Kaffa, where he learned state administration. In 1520, Selim IV died and Suleiman became sultan. Unlike his father, who seized power through struggle, Suleiman's accession was relatively peaceful. He was the sole claimant, and his position was strong. However, at the very beginning of his reign, he had to demonstrate his strength to earn the respect of the Janissaries in the court. Thus began a new era that brought the Ottoman Empire to its zenith. From the outset, Suleiman proved himself not only a commander, but also a far-sighted statesman. He continued the conquests, expanding the empire's borders, but also implemented large-scale reforms, strengthening the state's internal structure. His reign became the golden age of the Ottoman Empire. His military campaigns began with a push into Europe. In 1521, he captured Belgrade, opening the way for the Ottomans into Central Europe. 5 years later, he inflicted a crushing defeat on the Hungarian army at the Battle of Mohacs. The Ottoman cavalry overwhelmed the Hungarians, and the Danube River became the final stand where a significant portion of the Hungarian army perished. After this battle, much of Hungary came under Ottoman control, and the kingdom became a vassal state. However, Suleiman's main adversary was the Holy Roman Empire, led by Charles V. The Ottomans sought to advance deeper into Europe, but Austria stood in their way. In 1529, the Ottoman army besieged Vienna, but failed to capture it. The onset of winter, lack of supplies, and formidable fortress walls made the Austrian defense impregnable. Despite this failed assault, Europe realized that the Ottomans were the dominant military force of their time. Suleiman didn't limit himself to European wars. He also campaigned against Persia and expanded Ottoman influence in North Africa. In 1522, the Ottoman fleet captured Rhodes from the Knights Hospitaller, and in 1541, Algiers formally became an Ottoman province. The Ottoman admiral Barbarossa secured Ottoman dominance in the Mediterranean Sea. Hayreddin Barbarossa, a man whose name struck fear into European monarchs, a genius of naval warfare, pirate, conqueror of the Mediterranean, he transformed the Ottoman fleet into the most formidable force of its time. Barbarossa was born in the late 15th century on the island of Lesbos to a Greek or Albanian father who had converted to Islam. He had 3 brothers, and from youth, they chose a life of adventure and profit. Merchant ships, captured loot, battles with the Spanish and Italians. This was their way of life. 2 brothers, Oruç and Hayreddin, quickly became known throughout the Mediterranean. Their red beards earned them the nickname Barbarossa. Oruç was the first to envision moving beyond mere piracy to become a true ruler. In 1516, he captured Algiers and proclaimed himself its ruler, but the Europeans couldn't tolerate such a threat. The Spanish launched an expedition, and in 1518, Oruç died in battle. Hayreddin took his place, but he understood that piracy alone wasn't enough to hold power. So, he made a move that changed his life. He offered to make Algiers part of the Ottoman Empire. In return, he gained the backing of the most powerful state of his time. The Sultan agreed. In 1519, Barbarossa became the official Ottoman governor of North Africa and Grand Admiral of its fleet. Now he wasn't just raiding ships, he commanded entire squadrons, had Ottoman troops at his disposal, and conquered cities. In 1534, he captured Tunis, but Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, recaptured it a year later. In response, Barbarossa unleashed a reign of terror across the Mediterranean. His ships attacked Genoa, Venice, and the French and Spanish coasts, plundering cities and taking thousands captive. Europe didn't know how to stop him. But Barbarossa's greatest triumph was the Battle of Preveza in 1538. The Christian powers united their forces, assembling a powerful fleet. Venice, Spain, Genoa, and the Knights of Malta sent dozens of ships commanded by the famous Admiral Andrea Doria, considered invincible. But even he proved powerless against Barbarossa. Barbarossa used cunning tactics, lured the enemy into a trap, and routed them, destroying or capturing dozens of ships. This battle effectively made the Mediterranean an Ottoman lake. After this victory, Barbarossa became the most influential figure in the Ottoman navy. During his tenure, Barbarossa created a powerful system of control over sea lanes. The pirate fleets of North Africa became part of the Ottoman military, and his ships reigned supreme in the Mediterranean. When he retired, he didn't have to hide or flee from enemies like many other pirates. He became an advisor to the Sultan. He died in 1546, leaving behind a legacy that long outlived him. While the fate of borders was decided on battlefields within the walls of Topkapi Palace, the main residence of the time, another fate was being decided, that of power itself. Ottoman sultans were absolute rulers, but decisions weren't always solely theirs. Behind the scenes lurked another center of power, the harem. It was there that future sultans were raised, political alliances formed, and the most influential women could effectively run the state. And one of those who changed the history of the Ottoman Empire was Roxolana, known as Hürrem Sultan. The Ottoman harem was not simply a palace filled with beautiful women, as often imagined. It was a complex world of intrigue, power struggles, and subtle politics, where the fates of rulers could be decided behind closed doors. Women entered the harem through various paths. Some became concubines to the sultan, but few could attain great influence. To achieve this, they needed not only beauty, but also intelligence, cunning, and political acumen. And one of the most influential women in Ottoman history was Roxolana, better known as Hürrem Sultan. She was born in the first half of the 16th century in the lands of modern-day Ukraine. Her real name was likely Anastasia or Alexandra Lisovska. In her youth, she was captured by Crimean Tatars, who sold her into slavery. Subsequently, she ended up in the Ottoman harem. In those times, many girls from Eastern Europe found their way into the Sultan's harem, but only a handful achieved power. Roxolana didn't just become one of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent's favorites. She changed the course of Ottoman history. From the beginning, she stood out among the other concubines. Her intelligence, lively character, and charm distinguished her. It was for her cheerful disposition that she was named Hürrem, meaning the joyful, or the laughing one in Persian. However, beneath her lightheartedness lay a sharp mind and incredible ambition. She managed to become the Sultan's chief consort and then his legal wife. This was unprecedented in the Ottoman Empire. Before her, no concubine had become the Sultan's wife, as Ottoman rulers avoided marriage to prevent women from gaining political influence. However, Suleiman was so devoted to Hürrem that he broke with tradition. He officially married her and also allowed her to remain in Istanbul instead of being sent to the old palace, as was customary for mothers of heirs. This gave her immense influence in the empire's life. Hürrem began to play an active role in state affairs. She corresponded with foreign rulers, including the King of Poland, the Austrian Habsburgs, and even the Pope. Her letters are full of diplomatic subtleties, indicating her high level of education and understanding of world politics. However, her main influence was on the empire's internal politics. She actively interfered in palace intrigues, eliminating her rivals. Her chief opponent was Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha, Suleiman's closest friend and advisor. He held enormous influence over the Sultan and could obstruct Hürrem's plans. In 1536, he was executed, and many historians believe Hürrem played a key role in his downfall. Her most significant achievement was securing the throne for her son. In Ottoman tradition, the heir was not necessarily the eldest son, but the one who proved strongest. Often, a brutal struggle erupted among the Sultan's sons, in which the losers perished. The main rival to Hürrem's son, Selim, was Mustafa, Suleiman's eldest son by another concubine. Mustafa was a talented commander and a favorite of the army, considered the ideal heir. However, Hürrem did everything possible to eliminate him. She spread rumors that Mustafa was allegedly plotting against Suleiman. In 1553, the Sultan, believing these accusations, ordered his son's execution. After this, the path to power was open for Selim. It was Selim who ascended the throne, although he was a weak ruler. For Hürrem, the main goal was achieved. Her descendants continued the dynasty. Beyond political intrigue, Hürrem made significant contributions to culture and charity. She commissioned mosques, hospitals, baths, and schools not only in Istanbul, but also beyond. Hürrem died in 1558, 8 years before Suleiman. She became the first woman in Ottoman history to be buried in a mausoleum within the Süleymaniye Mosque complex. After her, the influence of women in the harem only grew, soon ushering in an era known as the Sultanate of Women, when mothers and wives of sultans governed the state from behind the scenes. The story of Hürrem Sultan is about how a woman who entered the harem as a slave managed to become one of the most influential figures in Ottoman history. Her intelligence, cunning, and foresight allowed her to leave her mark on history, and her descendants ruled the empire for many more decades. Besides conquests, Suleiman the Magnificent left behind something more enduring than military victories. He understood that a ruler's true power is measured not only by the extent of his empire, but also by what he creates for future generations. That's why his reign saw the beginning of a golden age of architecture, and its chief creator was an architect whose name is forever etched in history, Mimar Sinan. Sinan was born in the late 15th century into a Christian family within the Ottoman Empire, likely in Anatolia. In his youth, he was conscripted into the Janissaries, the Sultan's elite troops, through the Devshirme system, where he received military training. However, instead of becoming a warrior, he demonstrated exceptional engineering abilities. During military campaigns, he built bridges, fortresses, and aqueducts. In 1539, Suleiman appointed him chief imperial architect, marking the start of his illustrious career. Suleiman set Sinan an ambitious task: to create architectural masterpieces that would not only glorify the Ottoman Empire, but surpass everything that existed before. The Sultan dreamed of structures that could rival the grandeur of Hagia Sophia. Sinan's first major work was the Shehzade Mosque in Istanbul, built in memory of the Sultan's prematurely deceased son. Although already a masterpiece, the architect himself considered it an apprentice piece. The true flourishing of his talent came with the construction of the Süleymaniye Mosque, one of the most magnificent complexes in the Ottoman Empire. The Süleymaniye was an entire complex, including madrasas, schools, a hospital, a library, caravanserai, inns, and baths. Its dome, soaring above the city, conveyed a sense of power and harmony. Innovative engineering solutions made it incredibly durable. Sinan used advanced construction methods, allowing the building to withstand earthquakes and other natural disasters. However, his greatest achievement is considered the Selimiye Mosque in Edirne, built during the reign of Suleiman's son, Selim II. Its dome was even larger than Hagia Sophia's, representing an architectural triumph for the Ottoman Empire. Over his lifetime, Sinan designed and built more than 300 structures: mosques, palaces, bridges, baths, and aqueducts. He elevated Ottoman architecture to an art form, leaving a legacy that continues to inspire awe today. It showed that the glory of a conqueror might fade, but stone remains eternal. Thanks to the alliance of Sultan and architect, the heart of the Ottoman Empire gained buildings that have endured for centuries and still symbolize its former greatness. After the death of Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Empire continued to expand, but within the palace walls, another battle raged, no less bloody than the wars against Europeans and Persians. The struggle for power was waged not only between viziers and the army, but also in the very heart of the empire, the harem. This was a hidden battlefield where the fate of rulers was decided. Conspiracies were hatched, rivals were eliminated, and the empire's future depended on women whose influence remained in the shadows. The harem was a center of Ottoman politics, where sultans' mothers and concubines governed the state through their sons. Unlike Europe, where the throne automatically passed to the king's eldest son, Ottoman tradition lacked a strict order of succession. In the Ottoman Empire, the ruler was not the firstborn, but the one who managed to seize and hold power. This meant that the sultan's sons, born to different mothers, became enemies from birth. Their fates were decided not only on battlefields, but also in the dark corridors of the palace, where the harem was the hub of intrigue and political games. Concubines who bore the sultan's sons understood that their lives depended entirely on their children's success. If their son lost the struggle for the throne, he would be killed, and his mother would lose power along with him. To survive, the women of the harem used every available means: intrigue, spies, bribery, and sometimes assassination. The harem became an arena for the struggle for the throne, where the empire's future hinged on who proved shrewder, smarter, and more ruthless. The sultanas gained particular influence during the era known as the Sultanate of Women, a period when the mothers and wives of sultans effectively ran the state. They used the harem as their primary instrument of power. These women controlled the appointment of viziers, eliminated enemies, forged alliances, and made decisions that determined the country's fate. Some ruled openly as official regents, others operated through their sons, but all transformed the harem into a veritable political stage. Stemming from these customs was the practice of fratricide. A new sultan, to avoid potential rebellions, would order the execution of all his brothers. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was a measure dictated by reality. The Ottoman Empire lacked a stable system of inheritance, and every son of the sultan could claim the throne. If even one prince remained alive, he could become the focus of a conspiracy and overthrow his brother. This custom became particularly entrenched after the death of Suleiman the Magnificent. His son Selim II took the throne without a fight, but in subsequent decades, fratricide became the norm. Young princes who could potentially claim the throne were strangled with a silken cord, considered an honorable death for members of the ruling family. Sometimes, specially trained deaf-mute executioners were used for this purpose to prevent information leaks. But even despite these measures, conspiracies never ceased. Many sultans lived in constant fear, knowing that a traitor could be among their closest circle. Viziers, generals, courtiers, anyone could become part of palace intrigues, and dissatisfied forces within the empire sought ways to install a more convenient candidate on the throne. Among the many women who left their mark on Ottoman history, Kösem Sultan stands apart. She didn't just rule the country through her son, she effectively controlled the entire empire for several decades. Kösem was of Greek origin and entered the harem during the reign of Sultan Ahmed I. She quickly became his chief consort and bore him several sons. However, her path to power began after the sultan's death. Unlike other concubines who lost influence after their patrons died, Kösem managed to retain her power and govern the state through her children and grandchildren. When her son, Murad IV, ascended the throne, she became regent, effectively ruling the country in his name. Her power wasn't limited to palace intrigues. She controlled the appointment of viziers, forged alliances, and eliminated rivals. But her greatest influence manifested after Murad IV's death, when her other son, Ibrahim I, took the throne. This sultan was weak and mentally unstable, allowing Kösem to rule the state almost single-handedly. However, his unpredictable behavior led to a coup. He was overthrown and executed, and Kösem once again found herself at the center of a power struggle. When her grandson Mehmed IV ascended the throne, Kösem became regent again. Now she controlled not only the country, but the dynasty itself. She eliminated enemies one after another, without question. Viziers and emirs understood that disobeying her meant signing their own death warrant. But even the most powerful woman in the empire couldn't rule forever. In 1651, Kösem was assassinated on the orders of her daughter-in-law, Turhan Sultan, who decided to eliminate her overly influential mother-in-law to rule the empire herself. The story of Kösem Sultan shows that power in the Ottoman Empire belonged not only to the sultans. The harem wasn't just a place for the ruler's entertainment, but a real political center where the empire's destiny was forged. After the period of great conquests and stable rule, the Ottoman Empire gradually changed. Sultans increasingly delegated state management to their grand viziers. These men controlled finances, the army, foreign policy, and internal order. They decided which wars to wage, with whom to form alliances, and whom to execute. Sometimes their influence was so great that sultans became mere figureheads, while key decisions were made by the viziers. While sultans amused themselves in the harem or went hunting, it was the viziers who governed the empire, determining its fate. One of the most outstanding grand viziers was Mehmed Köprülü. In the mid-17th century, the Ottoman Empire was going through difficult times. Janissary revolts erupted in the capital, officials were mired in corruption, European powers were regaining territories, and chaos seemed unstoppable. In 1656, the reigning Sultan Mehmed IV offered the post of Grand Vizier to Köprülü, an experienced but stern man known for his inflexibility. He accepted, but on one condition: complete freedom of action. The Sultan had no choice but to agree. Köprülü immediately began restoring order in the army, brutally cracking down on rebellious janissaries. Any attempts at uprising were suppressed with extreme severity. Hundreds of rebels were executed, and survivors were sent to the empire's frontiers. Then he tackled corruption. Dozens of officials who had enriched themselves from the treasury were exiled or executed. Köprülü regained control over the provinces and began recovering lost territories. In 1669, the Ottomans defeated Venice and captured the island of Crete, concluding the Cretan War. Köprülü ruled successfully for several years, and his family continued his legacy, holding the country back from disintegration and achieving military victories. However, not all viziers were successful. One of the most notorious examples of failure was Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa, whose disastrous siege of Vienna in 1683 changed the course of Ottoman history. At that time, the Ottomans still aimed to push further into Europe. The vizier decided that the best way to strengthen Ottoman influence was to conquer Vienna, a key city that opened the path to Central Europe. Under his command, the Ottoman army numbered over 100,000 men. After several weeks of marching, the Ottomans surrounded Vienna. The garrison was much smaller than the Ottoman forces, and the city couldn't resist for long. However, Kara Mustafa opted against an immediate assault, deciding to starve the city into submission. He believed the defenders would eventually be exhausted. This plan proved fatal. While the Ottomans waited, the Christian states mobilized their forces. The Austrians and Poles assembled an army led by the Polish king Jan III Sobieski. When the Allied forces approached the Ottoman camp, Kara Mustafa still hoped to maintain the siege, but the enemy attacked first. At the battle's decisive moment, the Polish cavalry, the famed winged hussars, crashed into the Ottoman ranks, breaking their defense and forcing the Ottoman army to flee. The Ottoman army was routed, thousands of soldiers perished, and the troops retreated in panic. The defeat at Vienna was a catastrophe. Until then, the Ottomans had been the dominant military power in Europe, but now their expansion was halted. European countries went on the counter-offensive, and soon the Ottomans had to abandon Hungary and Transylvania. Upon his return, Kara Mustafa faced retribution. The defeat was so severe that Sultan Mehmed IV ordered the vizier's execution. He was strangled with a silken cord, the traditional execution method for high-ranking Ottoman officials. The Grand Viziers of the Ottoman Empire shaped its successes and failures. Some, like Mehmed Köprülü, saved the state from chaos and strengthened its position. Others made mistakes that cost the empire its power and influence. The defeat at Vienna was the first major blow to Ottoman might, but the war with Europe was only one side of the problem. While the Ottomans were losing ground in the Balkans, a new threat was emerging from the north. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire dominated the Black Sea region, controlling the crucial Crimea and keeping Russian lands isolated from the southern seas. However, in the late 17th century, a new state rapidly gaining strength entered the historical arena: Russia. Until then, Russia had not played a significant role in wars against the Ottomans. Muscovite princes and Russian czars periodically clashed with the Crimean Khanate, an Ottoman vassal, but couldn't stop its raids. For centuries, Crimean Tatars launched devastating campaigns into southern Russia, capturing tens of thousands of people into slavery. The Ottomans used Crimea as a tool to pressure Russia, maintaining their dominance in the region. Everything changed when Peter the Great came to power. Peter. I saw the Ottoman Empire as the main rival blocking Russia's path to the southern seas. He understood that without control over the Black Sea, Russia would remain cut off from world trade and unable to compete with European powers. The Ottomans and their Crimean allies completely blockaded Russia's southern borders, preventing trade through ports. For Russia, this was a strategic challenge demanding an immediate solution. In 1695, the Russian army undertook its first major campaign against the Crimean Khanate. Peter sent troops deep into Crimea, but faced serious difficulties. The Crimean Tatars, with their mobile cavalry, avoided open battles, instead employing scorched earth tactics, destroying supplies, and retreating deeper into the peninsula. The Russian troops found themselves in a barren steppe without sufficient provisions and water, forcing them to retreat. Despite this setback, the invasion itself showed Russia was now a serious threat to Ottoman positions in the region. In the early 18th century, Peter I continued his offensive. In 1711, he launched the Pruth campaign against the Ottomans. Russian forces entered the territory of modern Moldavia, but were surrounded by superior Ottoman forces. It seemed Russia would suffer a heavy defeat, but Peter managed to negotiate peace, promising to return the fortress of Azov, which he had captured earlier, to the Ottomans. This temporarily halted the war, but didn't change Russia's strategic plans. Peter I made it clear that the struggle for access to the southern seas was just beginning. crushing blow to Ottoman positions was delivered under Catherine the Great. Unlike Peter, who only laid the groundwork for expansion, Catherine not only challenged the Ottoman Empire, but inflicted one of its most severe defeats in history. In 1768, a new war broke out between Russia and the Ottoman Empire. Russian troops captured key fortresses on the Danube and in Crimea. In 1774, the Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca was signed, forcing the Ottoman Empire to recognize the independence of the Crimean Khanate. This meant Crimea was no longer an Ottoman vassal and could ally with Russia. The Ottomans hoped an independent Crimea would remain within their sphere of influence, but in 1783, Russia definitively annexed the peninsula. The Crimean Tatars, weakened by internal conflicts, couldn't organize resistance, and the Russian army occupied Simferopol and other key cities without a fight. This was a devastating blow to the Ottoman Empire, which lost control over the entire northern Black Sea coast. For the Ottomans, the loss of Crimea was not just a military defeat, but a genuine challenge to their status as a great power. The Ottomans had always seen themselves as defenders of Islam, and losing Crimea, with its Muslim population, struck at the Sultan's prestige. In response, the Sultan declared an eternal jihad against Russia, calling on all Muslims in the empire to fight for Crimea's return. However, this declaration could no longer change the situation. The Ottoman Empire was no longer strong enough to stop Russian expansion. After annexing Crimea, Russia gained access to the Black Sea, built new fortresses and naval bases, and its fleet began to dominate the region. The Ottomans, having lost Crimea, found themselves on the defensive, their influence in Europe and the Balkans shrinking. Strategic initiative now passed to Russia, which continued to push the Ottomans out of their territories in the following decades. The loss of Crimea became a symbol of the Ottoman Empire's weakening and the beginning of its long decline. By the early 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was no longer the formidable power that had once conquered cities, crushed armies, and besieged Vienna. Its defeats in wars with Russia and European powers showed that the empire could no longer compete with the newly powerful states. Ottoman armies, once the terror of Europe, now increasingly suffered defeats. The economy was in decline, and central authority weakened. European diplomats increasingly referred to the Ottoman Empire as the sick man of Europe, a decrepit power slowly fading and awaiting its end. The core problem was that the Ottoman Empire was stuck between the past and the future. On one hand, its rulers understood that without reforms, the country would eventually collapse. But on the other hand, any modernization faced resistance from the old Ottoman elite, the army, and religious leaders. European states were rapidly developing, transitioning to industrial economies, creating powerful armies, and implementing new technologies. The Ottoman Empire, however, remained largely a feudal state where much depended on the decisions of the Sultan and his circle. In the 19th century, Ottoman rulers attempted large-scale reforms. One of the first steps was the Tanzimat, a series of reforms initiated by Sultans Mahmud II and Abdülmecid I. The goal of the Tanzimat was to transform the Ottoman Empire into a modern state along European lines. Reforms were carried out in the army, tax system, and judiciary. Railway construction began. Secular schools were established, and laws became more equitable for Muslims and non-Muslims. However, these reforms failed to solve the main problem: the weakening of the central government's authority. The old Ottoman elites, including the remnants of Janissary influence and religious leaders, resisted the changes. Even in the army, despite modernization, discipline remained weak, and officers were often ill-prepared. Meanwhile, the empire's provinces began to slip out of control. Greece, Serbia, and Bulgaria gained independence. Egypt effectively ceased obeying the Sultan, and uprisings frequently erupted in the Balkans. But the most serious threat remained Russia. Starting in the 18th century, Russia waged constant wars against the Ottoman Empire, gradually pushing it out of the Balkans and the Black Sea region. This process accelerated in the 19th century. After Russia's victory in the Russo-Turkish War of 1828-29, the Ottomans had to recognize Greek independence, and the Russian fleet established control over the Black Sea. However, Russia wasn't the only power seeking to carve up Ottoman lands. Britain and France also viewed the Ottoman Empire as weakening territory ripe for exploitation. This became particularly evident during the Crimean War, 1853-56, when Britain and France unexpectedly allied with the Ottomans against Russia. The European powers didn't want Russia to completely destroy the Ottoman Empire, so they supported Istanbul. As a result, Russia suffered a defeat and temporarily lost influence in the Balkans. But the Ottomans didn't become stronger. The empire continued its descent into chaos. By the end of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire had become a state unable to determine its own destiny. European powers controlled its economy, imposed conditions on the Sultan, and dictated policy. Western countries invested heavily in building ports, railways, and factories, but these projects primarily benefited the investors rather than the Ottomans themselves. Debts to European banks mounted, and the Ottoman economy became increasingly dependent on the West. Around this time, the last significant ruler of the empire ascended the throne, Sultan Abdülhamid II. Establishing a harsh autocracy, Abdülhamid rolled back liberal reforms, suppressed opposition, controlled the press, and strengthened the role of Islam in state governance. He hoped that uniting the Muslim population around the Sultan would help preserve the empire, notably symbolized by projects like the Hejaz Railway connecting Istanbul to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. This was not only a political achievement, but also a symbol of reviving Islamic authority within the empire. However, despite Abdülhamid's efforts, saving the empire was already impossible. Uprisings in the Balkans continued. European powers increasingly interfered in Ottoman internal affairs, and discontent with the Sultan's dictatorship grew within the state itself. In 1908, the Young Turks, a group of officers and politicians advocating modernization and democratic reforms, staged a revolt and forced Abdülhamid II to restore the constitution he had previously suspended. A few years later, he was overthrown, and the Ottoman Empire entered the final tragic stage of its existence. Despite attempts at reform, strengthening central authority, and occasional support from Western powers, the empire continued to weaken. Russia, Britain, and France carved up Ottoman lands, supported Balkan rebellions, and exploited its economic fragility. Modernization efforts were either too shallow or met fierce internal resistance. Abdulhamid II was the last sultan who tried to halt the empire's disintegration, but even his stringent measures couldn't save the Ottoman state from its inevitable end. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was in deep crisis. Once a great power stretching from the Balkans to the Middle East, it was now merely a weak shadow of its former might. Nearly all European territories were lost. The economy was crumbling. The army hadn't been a match for European powers for a long time, and political instability made the Sultan's position increasingly precarious. The Ottomans understood that a new global conflict was inevitable, but choosing a side in this war proved fatal. They decided to bet on Germany, hoping that an alliance with the young, ambitious, and well-armed power would help them regain their former glory. The choice of Germany wasn't random. The Germans had been trying to establish a foothold in the Middle East for decades, investing in Ottoman industry, railways like the strategic Berlin-Baghdad line, and the army. German engineers built the vital railway connecting Europe to Baghdad, allowing the Ottomans to strengthen control over their eastern provinces. German officers reformed the army, training soldiers in European combat tactics. Furthermore, the Ottomans believed an alliance with Germany would allow them to recover lost territories: Egypt, the Balkans, perhaps even Crimea. But most of all, they were driven by hatred for their long-standing enemies, Russia, Great Britain, and France, who made no secret of viewing the Ottoman Empire as the sick man of Europe and were waiting for an opportune moment to divide its lands. When the war began, the Ottomans hoped for a swift victory, but reality proved much harsher. Within the first months, it became clear that the army was inadequately prepared, supplies were poor, and many generals were more concerned with political intrigue than victory. The first test for the Ottomans was the Caucasus campaign against Russia. In the early winter, Ottoman Minister of War Enver Pasha sent tens of thousands of soldiers across snow-covered mountain passes, hoping a surprise attack would avenge past defeats. But this gamble turned into a catastrophe. Severe frosts hit the mountains, soldiers died from cold and hunger, and the Russians, exploiting their weakness, delivered a devastating blow at Sarikamish. The Ottoman army was almost completely destroyed. On the Western Front, the situation was no better. Great Britain and France attempted to break through Ottoman defenses near the Straits to open a route to Russia. Thus began the Gallipoli campaign, Dardanelles operation, one of the bloodiest battles of World War I. The Allies landed large forces on the Gallipoli Peninsula, expecting a quick victory, but the Ottomans were prepared to defend. A young officer, Mustafa Kemal, little known at the time, personally led soldiers into battle and halted the advance. Despite horrific losses on both sides, the British and French failed to capture the Straits and were forced to withdraw. This was one of the few Ottoman victories, but it couldn't change the overall course of the war. While heavy fighting continued on the fronts, discontent simmered within the country. The Ottoman Empire was too vast, inhabited by too many diverse peoples, and not all were willing to die for the Sultan. This was especially true in the Arab provinces. Britain exploited the situation, encouraging Arab tribes to revolt. In the deserts of Arabia, a rebellion erupted, led by the Sharif of Mecca, a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. The British secretly supplied the rebels with weapons and sent advisors, including the famous T.E. Lawrence of Arabia. The Arabs began attacking Ottoman garrisons, cutting railway lines, and refusing orders from Istanbul. The Ottoman army suffered one defeat after another. Britain attacked Mesopotamia and Palestine. Its troops captured Baghdad and later entered Jerusalem. Eventually, enemy armies reached Damascus, and the Ottomans could no longer mount resistance. The army was exhausted, morale shattered, and provinces slipped out of control one by one. In October 1918, the Ottomans were forced to sign the Armistice of Mudros. It was the end of the war, but not the end of suffering. The Allies didn't just win, they began carving up Ottoman lands. France occupied Syria and Lebanon, Britain took Iraq and Palestine, Greece landed troops in Izmir, and Istanbul itself was occupied. The Ottoman Empire officially ceased to exist on the map, but one man refused to let Turkey disappear. Mustafa Kemal, the hero of Gallipoli, refused to submit to the Allies. Instead, he traveled inland, gathered supporters, and declared that the fight continued. In 1919, he led the National Liberation Movement, established a government in Ankara, and began the War of Independence. They did not want to become a colony. When the Allies signed the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, which effectively dismantled Turkey as a state, Mustafa Kemal refused to recognize it. He launched a war against the Greeks occupying western Anatolia and inflicted a decisive defeat upon them. Then he turned his attention to occupied Istanbul. In 1922, the Sultanate was officially abolished. The last Sultan, Mehmed VI, fled Istanbul aboard a British warship. The Ottoman Empire ceased to exist. In 1923, Mustafa Kemal proclaimed the establishment of the Turkish Republic, becoming its president. He implemented radical reforms. Turkey was no longer an Ottoman monarchy. It became a secular state. Sharia law was abolished. Women gained equal rights with men, and the army and education system were completely reformed. Even the alphabet changed. Kemal introduced the Latin script instead of Arabic writing, making it easier for Turks to learn modern sciences. Thus ended the history of the Ottoman Empire. After 6 centuries of wars, conquests, and defeats, it vanished, giving way to the new Turkey, and the man who rebuilt the country from ashes remained in history as Ataturk, the father of the Turkish people. In 1923, the Ottoman Empire, which had existed for over 6 centuries, finally ceased to exist. Its last ruler was Sultan Mehmed VI, a man who, until the very last moment, hoped to retain some semblance of power. But the time for monarchy in Turkey had passed, and history turned towards a new state, a new leader, and a new era. Mustafa Kemal, who became the symbol of resistance and the struggle for independence, proclaimed the birth of the Turkish Republic. What did the future hold for it? The final months of the Sultanate were spent in humiliation and fear. After defeat in World War I, the Ottoman Empire was occupied by Entente troops, its lands divided, and its capital, Istanbul, under British and French control. During this time, the Sultan's power was purely nominal. Effectively, Mehmed VI was a puppet in the hands of foreign powers. When the Grand National Assembly of Turkey officially abolished the Sultanate in 1922, the Sultan was forced to flee. On the night of November 17th, he boarded the British warship HMS Malaya, which took him to the island of Malta. Thus ended the Ottoman dynasty, after more than 6 centuries of rule. While the last sultan was leaving the country, Mustafa Kemal and his comrades in Ankara were laying the foundations for a new Turkey. They understood that the Ottoman legacy was too outdated for the modern world and that the country needed radical reforms. The Ottoman Empire had lived by laws centuries old, and most of its institutions belonged to that era. Mustafa Kemal decided to break with the past and create an entirely new state. On October 29, 1923, he officially proclaimed the establishment of the Turkish Republic. On that day, Turkey became a secular national state, and Mustafa Kemal was elected its first president. From that moment, a new epoch began, an era of modernization and fundamental change. Mustafa Kemal, later given the title Ataturk, meaning Father of the Turks, envisioned Turkey as independent, strong, and modern. The first step was the abolition of the caliphate. Ottoman sultans were not only rulers of the country, but also considered spiritual leaders of the Muslim world. In March 1924, the caliphate was abolished and all power transferred to the secular government. Then followed large-scale reforms in all spheres. Mustafa Kemal changed the education system, creating secular schools so people could acquire modern knowledge. He replaced the Arabic script with the Latin alphabet to facilitate literacy. Religious courts were abolished, and the country adopted European legal systems. Women were granted rights they never had under the Ottomans. They could now receive education, work, and participate in politics. New laws regarding clothing were introduced. Traditional Ottoman fezzes were banned, and the population was encouraged to wear European attire. The economy also demanded change. The Ottoman Empire had depended on European banks and foreign capital, but Mustafa Kemal wanted Turkey to develop its own industry and agriculture. Construction of roads, factories, and enterprises began. The country started gradually transforming into an industrial state. These reforms faced resistance, especially from conservatives and supporters of the old regime. Many were displeased with the abolition of the caliphate and the diminished role of Islam in the state. Some military figures, accustomed to Ottoman traditions, felt the country was losing its identity. However, Mustafa Kemal acted decisively. He suppressed rebellions, thwarted attempts to restore the old order, and even executed conspirators seeking to return the country to its past. But despite the break with the Ottoman system, its legacy did not vanish completely. Even after the empire's fall, many Ottoman traditions continue to live on in modern Turkey. The architecture of palaces, mosques, and fortresses still recalls the empire's former glory. Many Turkish dishes, music, and traditions of hospitality are rooted in the Ottoman past. Even Turkey's legal system, despite reforms, retains some features of Ottoman legislation. Furthermore, Ottoman influence is not limited to Turkey. Former Ottoman territories such as the Balkans, the Middle East, and North Africa still bear traces of Ottoman rule. In Bosnia, Albania, and Kosovo, many people practice Islam, which spread there during the Ottoman era. In Arab countries, the influence of Ottoman architecture and administrative systems persists. The Ottoman Empire disappeared, but its spirit continues to live on in Turkey and beyond. Mustafa Kemal created a new state, yet the country could not completely shed its past. Turkey remains a bridge between East and West, between Islamic tradition and European modernization, between the legacy of the Ottoman Empire and aspirations for the future.